Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Elizabeth Lohman, Marketing Director at Fortify Data, and I'm going to serve as your moderator. Please note that all participants are on mute, but if you have questions, you can submit them via the chat box, and we'll address them after the presentation. So our focus this afternoon is on all things ransomware, and so I'd like to pass it on to our speakers to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their companies. Frank, let's start with you.
Awesome. Thank you. My name is Frank Barbella. I'm the founder and CEO of Solve Risk Solutions. We're a risk management advisory and insurance brokerage firm. Our three practice areas are advisory, brokerage, and compliance. We focus on risk management and mitigation for private equity, mid-market, and enterprise risk.
Great. How about you, Rick?
Still on mute, Rick.
Hello?
There we go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. My name is Rick Warner. I work for Solve Risk Solutions, and I'm the practice leader for the executive risk side of the business, which includes cyber liability as various directors and officers, employment practice, FI crime, kidnap, ransom, extortion, reps, and warranties.
Great, thank you. And finally, Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric Smith. I'm the IT director for Fortify Data. I have a background in enterprise infrastructure and IT cybersecurity, and Fortify Data is a cyber risk management company. We produce software that helps you manage and assess your cyber risk.
Perfect, appreciate that. Thank you, gentlemen. So Eric, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. So 2020 brought us lots of headlines involving ransomware attacks. So can you talk a little bit about some of the recent trends you've seen?
Absolutely. Probably the one that's foremost on everybody's mind is the one that's made the most recent headlines, and that was the Sunburst attack that caused considerable problems with the U.S. government and lots of very, very large companies. This is a type of attack. It's known as it's a supply chain attack. And what that means is hackers did not actually attack the companies that were ultimately affected directly. They instead attacked companies that supply them with mission critical software. They then used this software that is installed on lots of very large companies with very complex environments as a springboard to actually do the final ransomware attacks. And nothing like that has ever happened before. It opens up a whole new problem to look at, whereas a lot of your other ransomware attacks were preceded by attacking users directly, via email or things of that nature. But the supply side attacks are a whole new animal, and it's totally causing us to totally rethink how we're going to defend against this. One of the other big challenges that's facing everyone over the last year is fallout from the pandemic, which has caused a decentralization of the workforce. You have a lot of people working from home, and what that's done is it's taken a lot of your users that used to operate within what you would typically call like a protected citadel of your company, behind firewalls where you have lots of monitoring and intrusion detection type systems, tight control configuration, and so forth. When you take people out of that environment, make them work from home, replicating that functionality is difficult, or in some cases impossible. And it's causing a lot of IT directors to have to scramble to find ways to monitor and maintain systems. And a lot of them, this is a totally new paradigm for them to look at. And they're not ready for it. And we're seeing in the assessments that we do and the data that we gather that the security posture of lots of companies is in decline. They're scrambling to figure out how to fix it, but this has opened up entirely new avenues to get compromised. The other major trend we're seeing is in the beginning, ransomware was oriented around you get infiltrated, they encrypt a bunch of your files so that you can't get to them anymore, and they ransom the decryption keys to you. One of the other recent trends is they don't actually encrypt your files. Instead, they steal all your data and then they threaten to release it publicly if you don't pay the ransom. That's, again, all new ways of attacking and doing things, and we're trying to figure out ways that we can defend against it and mitigate the impacts of it.
Awesome, thank you. Now, how about you, Frank? What kind of trends has the insurance industry seen in regards to ransomware?
You know, Eric spoke of some, and I won't dwell on those, but want to discuss, you know, from an insurance carrier perspective, the top 5 claims that they're seeing, the number one being phishing attacks or social engineering, which is the easiest way to gain access into somebody's information. But the issue there from an insurance perspective is the fact that they trick you out of your information. So it's not an actual cyber attack. So which can be misconstrued. So the second thing is obviously ransomware and malware outbreaks, which we're talking about today, misconfiguration of systems, cyber-related business interruptions, and the fifth being various privacy-related events, specifically around vicarious liability. So housing that information and being vicariously liable. The average claim payment had more than quadrupled in the last 15 months, which was just under $50,000 on any one attack. Now they're at the end of September, those averages are 233,000, and most of the carriers are predicting that by the end of the first quarter, those will be around 300,000. Is the average claim payment that they're seeing. At the end of Q3, 4 out of the top 10 threat actors were actually new groups with new malware. So obviously they just keep getting more tricky. And the most attacked sector of companies are those with 11 and 100 employees, and that's at about 40%. 70% of attacks are on companies $50 million in revenue and under. So it's just an easier way for them to gain access. And we have less policies, procedures, and protocols to prevent that. And typically, that's why they can get in very easily. The issue businesses will face with the information that carriers will begin to limit coverage, and Eric touched on Sunburst specifically, is we're seeing specific exclusionary language around certain breaches like Sunburst that might be effective. So basically in those policies, if they, based on certain data sets that they get from you through an application process, typically if they know or suspect that you were part of that Sunburst case, that new policy might have some type of exclusionary language on it around that case. So, and carriers, based on data they receive, understand a client's risk better than they do, and they focus on limiting that exposure. Funny thing I read recently at one of Warren Buffett, who owns many insurance companies, at his annual shareholder meeting, he talked about cyber being uncharted waters and will only get worse. He said underwriters that say they understand the future cyber risks from an actuary perspective are kidding themselves. So basically in that same meeting, he just said that they will be either mitigating future cyber policies in his insurance companies, or at least limiting the capacity that's available to buy.
Okay, great, thank you. So Eric, I'm going to throw it back to you. Just so everyone gets a little bit more familiar with things, can you explain the primary ways ransomware gets into a company?
Sure. The classic route that has been used and is still continue to be used in the majority of attacks is usually via what Frank mentioned earlier, a form of social engineering attack. Usually what will happen is an attacker will send a malicious email. Now, when I say malicious email, what does that mean? Does it mean it has a virus as an attachment? While that can be the case, much more frequently it is an email that gets you to disclose information about yourself. That's why it's called a social engineering attack. And then they use that information to gain access to privileged systems that that person would normally have access to. The classic email of you send an invoice to accounts payable acting like you're a vendor, and it's click here to open the invoice information. It takes you to a website and asks you to log in or give some form of information, what have you. You think that this is a legitimate account. You see hundreds, if not thousands, of these every month, and you innocently go through and enter this sensitive information, and that's all that it takes. One of the discussions we were having earlier on before the panel started here was that there's a lot of attention paid to beefing up perimeter security, antivirus, intrusion detection systems, and so forth. But the weak point in this chain is typically the human. You can't expect companies, especially larger companies, that everyone is going to be equally competent and vigilant about cybersecurity. And it's all too easy to get tricked. This happens all the time. I've seen it all the time. And every successful attack that I have seen started with a social engineering attack. That being said, we are coming across some new vectors, which are especially troubling. The sunburst being the most notable of those. The ability to, well, you install software from reputable vendors all the time. Nearly all of us are probably using Microsoft Windows on your machines right now. And you undoubtedly get prompted periodically to install patches and updates to keep your machine secure. And you assume that those patches and updates that you're installing are safe. And by and large, they are. But if one of these major suppliers gets hacked and they don't realize it for some time, they can do exactly what happened in the Sunburst attack. They can infiltrate that software, and the next time you download and install a patch or an update, you're installing their malware. And the ones that took over SolarWinds and did what they did, they were very, very sophisticated. They covered their tracks very well. They bided their time, which is also something that we're seeing is relatively new, is that they're waiting for the most opportune moments to attack. They're using the time in between to gather intelligence on their targets, figure out what is the best place to hit, where and when. Those are the newest attack vectors. The one thing I want to make sure everyone is well dissuaded from is there is this myth purported, largely, what you see in television and movies, that hackers are sitting there trying to bash their way through a firewall, or they guess your password on 3 attempts, just out of the blue. That doesn't happen. Nobody does that anymore. It's the perimeter defenses are generally far too strong. But that's because there are far easier targets, and that is by manipulating people to giving you the information that they need to carry out a successful attack. Once they've compromised your systems internally, or rather they've even just compromised a single workstation, they then use that as a springboard for additional attacks behind your defense perimeter. And they can then attack much more sensitive assets. And since a lot of companies have spent a lot of attention on their perimeter security, they have not spent as much time doing internal security. And as such, you'll find a lot of internal assets are very loosely secured, poorly configured. Access rights are far too permissive. And people have access to things and get in to do stuff that they really don't need to in order to do their jobs.
Great, thank you. You touched on this a little bit, but can you do a deeper dive into some of the basic steps a company can take to protect themselves against ransomware?
Absolutely. Oh, 1 second here. My cat wanted to join the panel. One of the dangers of working from home. Let's see here. The basic steps a company could take. Well, first and foremost, don't neglect your perimeter security. There's no sense in making it easy for them. Probably one of the best, most effective defenses I see that I have seen, but I see so rarely, is effective email security. A lot of people install some basic filters or put antivirus in place and they think they're done, or that's the best they can do. There are a lot of products that are out there, and I'm not going to name names, but there are a lot of products out there that take a very advanced approach to email filtering. They use artificial intelligence to look at not only the attachments, but the content, who it's coming from, reputational services, and even some of the more advanced platforms can do things what's known as sandboxing, where if you receive an email that has a malicious link in it, and you click on that link, and it's going to happen. It's not something you can say, no, I put stuff in place that can't happen. No, it will. It will. You have to plan on it. But with some of these services, you can click on the links, and the actual transaction with the website takes place in a secure area called a sandbox, so that the malicious impacts of that link are either eliminated or severely mitigated. So that's one thing I would say is beef up your email security. Stop using basic filters and junk mail filters and get it something that is truly advanced. The other things that I frequently see that need to be touched up is a total lack or near lack of compartmentalization. Most users have a very specific set of assets that they need to have access to, assets and data, in order to do their jobs effectively. But quite frequently you'll find that they have access to far more information and far more assets than they actually need. Going with the concept that it's not if you're going to get compromised, but when. It's best to plan for that and build your systems compartmentalized so that you can limit the amount of damage that a compromise can do. The other piece of this is backups, backups, backups. I've always said you can never have too many backups, but going with the idea that it's not if, but when, the next thing you need to do is have a plan. Have a plan for how are you going to recover your data? How are you going to get back in business? Because as I'm sure some of the other gentlemen here will talk about, the impact of these things is far beyond just the individual compromises or disclosure of data. There's brand damage there's done. It's your ability to carry on doing business after such a compromise. So making sure you have that kind of policies and procedures, and it's not just enough to have it in a binder somewhere that nobody ever looks at. You need to test it. You need to test it regularly, and you need to test it under realistic scenarios as well. This is time consuming and it can be expensive, but it's far less time consuming and less expensive than dealing with a data breach that's gone out of control and put your business out of business.
Thank you, Eric. That's some very helpful information. Rick, I'm going to flip it over to the insurance side for a little bit. Can you talk to us about how can policies protect businesses against ransomware attacks? And what are some of the most common issues you find missing in cyber policies?
As Eric spoke a while ago, the biggest problem with keeping a loss, preventing a loss, the biggest weak link in the chain is individuals. So it's very, very important from an underwriting perspective. Underwriters are looking for companies that have policies, procedures, and protocols in place. But more than that, they want to make sure that they're being followed on a consistent basis and that they are being tested on a worst case basis at least once a year. Now, in the past, in the last 3 years, we've been very fortunate and we've had a very soft market in cyber. And so we've even had half-page applications, haven't we, Frank? Where we could get a quote for cyber in just a few minutes and have it come back, and it would have adequate coverage. But I'm telling you, because of the market is turning hard, because of the claim frequencies have not only gone up, but the claim severity of each claim has gone up. Underwriters are getting to become underwriters again, and so their applications are starting to get, more than just 1 or 2 pages. And what they're going to focus on are those things that Eric talked about. Is that, do you have protocols in place? Do you have a plan? I want to see a copy of a plan where if there is a breach, who do you get in touch with? How do you get in touch with them? What is the next steps going to be? Who are you going to have working with you? They're also going to want to see what you're doing to pre-mitigate, instead of having a claim, saying, what are you doing beforehand? Are you having your system tested regularly? Or what other outside resources are you having involved with the company to make sure that you keep your risk of breach down to a minimum. And then after that, they're looking for your breach response team. How are you going to affect it? If you don't have these things, what's going to happen, and we're seeing it now, is that when you have a hard market, and we are in a hard market now in cyber, it's going to continue to do that because claims are going to go up, and the number of claims they see are going to go up, is that they're going to limit the amount of limits that they're going to offer. So before, it was very easy for us to get $10, $15 million worth of limit from one carrier. We're starting to see that one carrier will only give us $5 million in limits, so we're having to build layers. That's more expensive for the insured. Coverages are getting a lot more expensive. And on top of that, the retentions, or what we call your deductibles, are going to rise significantly as well. And then the terms and conditions are going to suffer. We're enjoying a period of time right now where the policies are very, very voluminous in what types of coverages they give. So all of those things are going to be effective. And the best way to mitigate that with the underwriter is to show them that you're proactive, that you have policy procedures in place, that you're vigilant, making sure that they stay in place, that you're testing your system once a year, and that you're serious about keeping your claims down to a minimum. Eric is absolutely right. There's no way you're not going to have a claim. It's going to happen. So I think some new data came out where it says smaller companies with 100 employees up to what Frank said, 1,000 employees, we're seeing a 68% of the ransomware attacks happen in that area. And as Frank also mentioned, the fact that the limit or the cost of those claims are significant. So they range from, like you said, a low of 160,000 up to 200,000, and they continue to grow. And that grows at 37% every quarter since late 2019.
Okay, great. And how about, can you talk a little bit more into the steps that Eric talked about, the steps that a business can take? How do those affect an organization's cyber liability policy?
I'm sorry?
So some of the steps Eric was discussing earlier that organizations can take, how do those affect a cyber insurance liability policy?
Well, the underwriters they're going to underwrite policies now. They haven't been underwriting the information. So case in point, if you're following those rules and you're doing the best that you can, they're looking at that. They're going to ask those questions. Their reinsurance are requiring them to ask those questions now if they haven't before. And that's going to be either a debit or credit in regards to how they price it. They're also doing their own testing. And Eric, there used to be what we call you could test without going past the firewall, but they'll test to find out. They have their own software now and gives them the ability to test the initial firewall system without actually going into the system, which is what you do when you hire a third party to test it, just to make sure that you have the basics in place just so that you can qualify for a quote. So unless you have all these things presented in the application, and also your broker should help you if you do not. 80% of the folks don't have these protocols in place. 80% of these folks don't have it where they make sure that it's followed correctly. And so your broker should be able to provide you through the carriers, can provide you in setting up the basic protocols and telling you what needs to be done. And be truthful in your applications when you don't misstate anything, because underwriters are more concerned about writing the account than making sure that the accounts they write are good. And if they're not, they'll make helpful suggestions and can oftentimes help you get to that point.
Great, thank you, Rick. Eric, I'm going to turn it back to you. Kind of going back to technology, can you tell us a little bit about what makes Fortify different from other options on the market when it comes to effectively protecting your business against ransomware?
Well, I'm pretty sure everybody here is familiar with the old saying, what you don't know won't hurt you. And I can't think of a phrase I could disagree with more in this particular case. Pretty much all of the attacks that I have seen, heard, read about, and even been a part of in some unfortunate cases have revolved around not just compromising someone's individual credentials and getting to the files or applications that they're able to get to. Usually what will happen is, as I mentioned, they'll use that as a springboard to launch attacks on other assets. And as I also mentioned, it's quite frequently that your internal security is much more lax than your perimeter security. One of the things that we do at Fortify Data is we let you know what your actual risk level is, what your posture is. And we do this by not just going and gathering data passively. There's a concept known as OSINT. It stands for Open Source Intelligence. And it's the type of data that you can gather passively on a company to get some idea of their infrastructure or what security they may have in place and things like that, but it's relatively limited. What Fortify Data does differently than pretty much everyone else is we do what we call an active assessment. We don't just passively listen and take a look at stuff. We actively seek out your assets and evaluate each one of them against industry standards for what constitutes a secured system. For example, are you running the latest patches and updates? Do you have good access control lists in place? Do you have antivirus in place? Things of that nature, stuff that you just simply can't gather passively. The analogy I like to use is, okay, let's assume that you want to assess the security of a bank. Who would you rather, or whose report on bank security would you prefer to have? The guy that drives by, looks at the outside of the bank and says, yep, that looks okay. Or the guy that goes inside, talks to the tellers, looks at the security cameras and so forth, and tries to determine a little bit more in depth, okay, what is going on here? Are they really secure? Are they taking this seriously? Now, not right up to the point of trying to stage a break-in. That's a critical difference here. We don't do any kind of intrusive scans or any kind of data gathering that crosses that line, but we do go and gather every bit of data that can possibly be gathered without doing that. And then we present it in a way that doesn't just say, okay, here's what's wrong, but we also cross-reference it with the criticality of the data on the asset and take a step back and say, okay, not only is here's what's wrong, here's where it's wrong, and here's why you need to be concerned about it. And in some cases, we even take the next step and say, and here's what you ought to do about it.
Awesome, thank you. So Frank, what would help our audience be better prepared for a cyber attack from an insurance perspective? And how can Solve Risk Solutions support them?
So our firm, we look at cyber risk as basically a triangle. You have the actual cybersecurity technology systems and practices in place to keep threat actors out, and that's what Fortify Data does. There's also two other areas. You have cyber liability insurance that help protect you from financial loss, which most people go to their broker for. We do help in this area as in our advisory practice. We work with a lot of firms like Fortify Data and accounting firms and law firms that have clients that are very concerned about cyber liability, and we do what we call risk diligence on these policies. And we show clients, because what people don't realize is a cyber liability policy can have over 50 coverage parts. So it's very, very complex. So it might say $10 million, $20 million, $50 million on the top line saying, I have this much coverage, but there's limiting endorsements and exclusions that we find a lot of times. So we bring that clarity to a client and we show them, this is what this policy covers, here's what it doesn't cover, and here's a better way to structure that policy. The other area is cyber compliance, which is basically what happens after the breach. So policies, procedures, and protocols that need to be drafted and executed when you have the loss. And we've got a separate compliance practice that helps in that area. So we kind of mold these two together and not just write a policy for a client, not really understanding what the risk they have, because we're not technology folks. We take an application and send it off. We really get granular on the coverage piece. We don't have the expertise to do what, like I said, what Fortify Data does, but we feel the insurance policies and the protocols and procedures go hand in When we engage with clients, I've got a perfect example. We have a technology company that built management systems for financial institutions. They had a $10 million cyber policy. They felt they were covered. They purchased it from a broker and told us the biggest concerns they had were data breach and ransomware. And although it said $10 million on the top line of the policy, they had a sublimit of $100,000 for first and third party data breach, as well as an exclusion for ransomware. So the two areas that they were quite concerned with were actually very penalizing. So we help companies like that build robust cyber policies and put those compliance practices in place to help them execute when they actually have a breach in the future. We feel those two areas go hand in hand.
Okay, that's great information. Thank you. Thank you all. For now, we'd like to go ahead and open it up to some Q&A. So please feel free to submit any questions through the chat box, and we'll have our panelists address them. But I am going to ask one that's already popped in here. Eric, I believe this is to you. Does putting data in the cloud protect a company against ransomware?
No. Just because your data is not on your premise does not mean that it's somehow safe or immune. In fact, depending upon your familiarity with cloud environments, it could be even worse. The cloud itself it's a wonderful thing. It serves a vital need. So certainly not trying to say it's less secure. It can be as secure, but you have to know what you're doing. The way that cloud does things it's a new way of thinking and a new way of doing things. There's a lot of different security parameters that in our assessments we see a tremendous number of people miss. These are things that they would never have missed if their data was on premise or in a data center or something like that. But largely what we're seeing is that the biggest danger of putting anything in the cloud is the relative unfamiliarity a lot of businesses have with it, and understanding that it's a different way of doing the same thing you've always done. So making sure that you're covering all your bases, and I'll just pitch this momentarily, that's something that Fortify Data does is, for example, if you have a storage unit in Amazon Web Services that is poorly secured, it's something we find with disturbing regularity. But you can find that out. You can know and say, hey, do you realize this is publicly available to the entire world? You probably didn't intend for it to be that way. So things of that nature. So no, cloud is not a panacea that somehow removes you from the security equation. It's something that does the same job, but you have to know what you're doing, and you have to look at it through a different set of policies and procedures to make sure you're still covering all the same things you had to cover before.
Great, thank you. So another question that's come in, and I'll let you decide who wants to handle this, but someone says, I'm a small business owner and I outsource my e-commerce and IT functions. Does this mitigate or eliminate cyber risk? Is that the vendor's job?
I'll chime in briefly on this and say that just because you've outsourced it doesn't relieve you of the fallout if it goes bad. I would have to say probably the contract you have and liability insurance that they have, may come into play. But just because someone else is doing the job instead of internally, that doesn't really solve the problem or allow you really to effectively shift the blame. If you get owned, or I should say compromised, if you get compromised, it doesn't matter who was at fault. You're still compromised. Your data is still out there. Your brand is still damaged.
Yeah, I can tell you that when we get claims like this all the time, it's very important in your policies when you read them is that you have your policy extends to what we call independent contractors, simply because, again, it's your data. It's your customers' data that got lost. And just because you hired a third party, you're responsible for the errors and omissions of that third party because they got your customer's data. So the contract can help you to find out who's going to respond to the actual notification and claims and things like that. But it's extremely important to make sure your contracts are tight. And by the way, when your broker puts these policies together, to make sure that they look at those individual contracts so that the cyber policy will perform like you think they will and pick up that coverage when your third party that you're doing business with is not able to pick up the liability themselves and you get stuck with a bill, because you will get stuck with the liability in a situation like that. There's no question about it.
Thank you. Another question from an insurance perspective, if you're using a cloud service like AWS, does that mitigate your cost of your policy, or what sort of documentation do you need to supplement your policy?
Well, there's a standard question on all applications, asking how you store your information and your platform that you're operating on. Certainly, and Eric could probably speak better to this, there's, I guess, certain levels of sophistication within the different services that are available. But underwriters do ask that question, and from time to time we will see where the particular services they're written on are not something that the underwriter feels comfortable with. So it's a question of the application. It is important, but again, it depends on the quality of the provider that you're doing business with, and the underwriters do look at that, and it will have an effect on your pricing and the ability to get the terms that you want.
And to follow on with what Rick said, something like a cloud service like Amazon, I want to make sure this is clear. You can make a cloud arbitrarily secure. There's nothing in it that makes it inherently more or less secure than anything else. In fact, anything can be made arbitrarily secure. What it comes down to is knowing what you need to do to make it as secure as it needs to be made.
Great, thank you. So another question that's come in is, how much coverage do traditional Flabber policies have on third-party data breaches? Can you speak to that, Rick or Frank?
Yeah, I'll touch on it real quick. This is kind of a misconception. Everyone kind of thinks these are boilerplate kind of policies, and there's, believe it or not, no insurance policies boilerplate, even ones that are governed by ISO, the Insurance Service Office, but more on the executive risk side, so cyber liability, D&O, E&O, those areas. Those are manuscript forms, meaning those are individually written. And then they take certain data sets that you have based on, could be cap tables, your application, your financials, your loss information, all of this stuff. And then they back into that equation, and that becomes your policy. So no two policies are the same. And we get them all the time where you might have the full limit for first party coverage because they feel comfortable that you have the right policies and procedures, but they don't feel maybe the folks you're dealing with, based on, again, that data that they're reviewing that you give to them to review, they might not feel like you have great controls over third party information, so they limit that or they exclude third party. Like I mentioned before, there's over 50 coverage parts within a cyber policy, and they can be manipulated however the underwriter feels necessary to cover their risk.
Yeah, we typically see policies that matured a good bit, but one of the problems that we consistently saw is that Frank mentioned that we had a financial service provider who had a $10 million policy, but when they had a claim, they found out they only had $100,000 for certain type risk. And underwriters understand what their most exposure is. So typically you will see third-party liability with a large limit. But then you'll see on the bottom side, which we call first-party liability, because there's two parts. They separate a policy, cyber policy, into two basic parts. They'll either call it first-party coverage or third-party coverage. But it's the first-party coverage typically where we see the inadequate limits. But now we're starting to see that play on the third-party side, where they're used to give very broad third-party coverage, but then all of a sudden they start nitpicking it, taking it away by endorsements. And a lot of people just don't read endorsements, or they don't understand it, because there is no two, Chubb, CFC, any Lloyd's of London facility like CFC, Beasley, Hiscox, AIG, Hartford, CNA, you name it. they use different terms and terminology for the same thing. So you just can't, it's not as easy as putting the policies together and checking off that, oh, A, B, C coverage. Everybody has a different way in which they view coverage. So it makes it even more convoluted and more harder to read to make sure that you have what you need on the policy. You just have to take time and sit down and go through it. Make sure your broker sits down with you and goes through it as well.
Thanks, Rick. We've got time for just a couple more questions, and I do have a couple others in the queue. One of them being, in your due diligence audits of cyber policies, how many of them have coverage issues that the client was not aware of?
Frank, you want to answer that?
Sadly, our metrics are 100% of the time that we perform risk diligence audits on cyber policies, we find issues, and it's varied. I mean, every single one of them is different, but they're always eye-opening. So it's very interesting. And again, they're so broad. There's so many different areas of coverage and that's why there's so many issues. And the breakdown is, on the brokerage side of our business, the issue is the client never reads the policies, and the misnomer is the broker never reads the policies, and that's the issue, and that's why there's landmines in these policies. So yeah, it's a sad issue.
Okay, and our last question before we wrap it up, there's currently an offering for cybersecurity insurance discounts with a particular insurance broker based on acquiring and using certain security products. Is this going to be a trend among cyber insurance companies? What are your thoughts?
Rick, you want to talk about it? Yeah, I can do it. Yes, it will be. And Rick talked a lot about, the different areas that they're going to be looking at. And again, the more underwriters love information. So the more information you can give them, the more comfortable they're going to feel with it. So as you have, these renewals on your policies, and if you're using a system like Fortify data or whatnot, make sure they're aware of that, because that's how, your broker is going to be able to negotiate. It's going to be number one on the systems and practices and policies that you do, but then also negotiating the terms and conditions of the actual policy. But it's going to be a different world here moving forward, just with all the attacks that we're seeing out there.
Yeah, I can tell you that, Frank, we had a credit union that took a very proactive role last year's renewal, where they sought several different outside vendors to help them improve their terms, conditions, their controls, their protocols to keep a breach in. They spent a lot of money on that. And so what we did as part of that is that we not only checked the boxes on the application, but we helped the client also ask them to provide them the reports that were provided by those third parties. We also gave them the information. We allowed them to see and gave them proof. It's one thing to check for somebody to look at a check mark, but it's another thing to say where it says see attached and actually see the work done. And as a result of that, they got a 15% discount on their premium on a six-figure premium amount. It's pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today. And a special thanks to our speakers for sharing your insights. All participants will receive a link to the full recording of this webinar, and we invite you to share it with your colleagues. With that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.